Hello there. Welcome to this week's live focus mini class. I'm happy to be here today and hope that you're feeling well. Hope everyone is surviving the chaos. We're doing our best, I know. Today I want to talk about the 5 basic principles of Yamuna body rolling. There are a lot of principles, but there's 5 biggies that we're going to go over today. And I'll do a little demo while we're kind of discussing this stuff. So if you do have a Yamuna ball, I encourage you to have it close by so you can maybe play around with some of these ideas with me. If you're here, say hello. I see a couple of you there. Hi. Welcome. This will be a review for you, Sarah, but it's always good to go back to basics. So even if you're a seasoned roller or even a practitioner yourself, it's always good to go back and visit these principles that we're going to talk about today. So I'm actually going to be pulling these right out of our certification manual. As many of you know, I'm a teacher trainer, so I certify other people to become certified Yamuna practitioners. And the principles that I'm going to go over with you today are directly out of the manual. So you're getting a little bit of an insider's look into these concepts. So if you're here live, say hello. And if you are watching on replay, give me a hashtag replay so I can find you and respond to you. Glad to see you. So let's just dive right in. So the 5 foundational concepts that I'm going to give to you today are in no particular order. So they're all really important. I'd say they're all equally important. And I'm just going to go through them in an order that seems to make organic sense to me as you think about it affecting your body. So I'll go ahead and start right off the bat with the first basic principle of YBR, Yamuna body rolling, is bone stimulation. So that is the thing that of all of the different qualities and traits of the Yamuna body rolling work, the bone stimulation is probably the thing that sets it apart from all other modalities the most. And the reason is because most myofascial modalities focus on just that, the fascia. And body rolling also does focus on the fascia, but first and foremost, it focuses on bone stimulation. So when we stimulate bone, and by bone stimulation, it's basically another way of saying weight bearing weight into the bone via the ball. So when we talk about bone stimulation, it's actually sort of a communication with other parts of your body. So when you sink in to one of the Yamuna balls and you let the ball penetrate through the layers of fascia and muscle and tendon and all of the soft tissue, once it makes its way through those layers up into the bone, your bones begin communicating with that soft tissue. So as soon as you bear weight into a bone, any soft tissue that is attached to it, and that could be ligaments, tendons, muscles, even fascia, all of that stuff receives the message that it does not need to be gripping for dear life. And this bone stimulation actually initiates a release of the tissue. So by working from the deepest layer out, we're actually really getting to kind of the root of the matter right off the bat. So we always start at that deepest layer. We always start with bone. We don't just immediately start ironing out or rolling out muscle or fascia, because we're skipping a huge component of our body and our structure if we do that. So we always go first to the deepest layer, bone. We bear weight into it, we stimulate the bone. That sends the message to the attaching tissue that, hey, it can start to release in the direction of its muscle fibers to its insertion point. So again, this is what really sets it apart, I feel, from a lot of other modalities. So yes, Yamuna body rolling is a myofascial technique, but I don't even really think of it. I don't usually, when I'm describing it to somebody, that's not the first thing that I would say to somebody, because it's so much more comprehensive than that. The myofascial release part is one aspect of the work, but the bone stimulation is huge. And I chose that as the first one to talk about, because even though I said no particular order, I feel like that's a pretty big one. So let's talk about what that means in your body then. So if you do have a Yamuna ball with you, I encourage you to grab it now. I've got this pearl one here. As you can see, I'm kind of up to my ears in balls, so I have a lot of them here, but I'm just gonna use this one right here. So throughout this little focus class, I'm going to be using the example of the hamstring release. So Actually, I forgot that I wanted to show you something on Skelly before I got on the ball. So in this case, we're going to work on that example of the hamstring release. So I want to explain what I mean here. It's so funny trying to get him up there. I want to explain what I mean about this bone stimulation piece. So in the example of the hamstrings, they originate, their origin attachment is right here on our, what we call our sit bones. So these are the bones that when you're sitting down, if you're sitting right now, you can probably feel them making contact with your surface, whether it's a chair or the couch or whatever it is. So if we want to release the hamstrings, the first thing we do is we bear weight into the sit bone, right where that hamstring tendon begins. And again, as we do that, that sort of initiates or facilitates this unwinding, this releasing of that origin point. So if, for example, the tendon is really bunched up right here on the bone, if it's all kind of snarled up and bunched up right there, simply pressing weight into the sit bone with the ball will actually start to send a message that it can start to unwind. And that brings us to some other principles, but we'll get there in a second. So I just wanted to show you that example on the skeleton. And now let's try it in our own body. So grab your ball, whether it's a pearl, gold, silver. You could also do this with a black ball. This particular example might be a little intense with a black ball, but you can certainly give it a shot. I'm going to back up a little so you can see my whole body here. So go ahead and find your sit bones. If you're not exactly sure where your sit bones are, if you kind of rock side to side, you'll feel these bony protrusions sticking out, kind of imprinting into the surface underneath of you. That's your sit bone. So you can take the ball right underneath that. Now I'm going to turn around for a second so that you can see. I am not on my tailbone. I'm off to the side. So here's my sit bone. Here's my other one over here. My tailbone's right here. So I'm never going to clunk down directly on my tailbone. That's a whole different, we'll talk about that another day. But for today, I want you to make sure that you're really on just that, that one side, that one sit bone. And I want you to just take a couple of breaths here. Really trying to let yourself become as weighted as possible. So if you imagine that you're almost like a rag doll, or I don't really like the term dead weight, but you get the idea what I mean by that, this idea of like a sack of potatoes type of thing. The reason is that you don't want to be pushing against the ball. You don't want to be doing effort. You don't want to be pressing or contracting or resisting or anything like that at all. It's the opposite of that. So you want to invite the ball through the layers of tissue all the way up into the bone. So all you have to do that is just sit and wait. So it's pretty easy, right? So you just kind of like hang out. You're going to take a couple of breaths. And as I exhale, it's a little easier to drop my weight on the exhale. So every time I get to that cycle and I start to breathe out, I want to really feel a sense of my body dropping down towards the ball. I see that you can't see my ball perfectly. Let me back up a little bit there. So as you're hanging out here and going through these breath cycles, the ball is working its way through all of the flesh and the fat and all of the soft tissue until it eventually makes its way to the bone. Once you get to the bone, that hamstring tendon starts to send the message, not just right here, but all the way down the leg, that whole hamstring can start to unwind. After you've had a few moments of stillness and breathing, you can add in a little kind of a wake-up movement where you start to sort of, you can move forward and back on the sit bone a little bit just to wake up all of the groups of muscles that originate here. So in this case, as I move forward, that ball goes back into my glute muscles. As I move back, it goes into the hamstring tendons a little bit. You can also go side to side, but my focus is still on the bone. So after you've done a couple forward, back, side to side, you can connect that by circling. To outline the edge of the sit bone. So you're circling around, and you'll find that there are certain areas that are harder to reach than others. But we're going to focus just on the bone for right now. So as you're stimulating the bone in this way, as you're bearing weight into the bone in this way, you're sending the message to these hamstring tendons, which live right here in this little space, that they don't have to be twisted up, snarled up, gripping. They actually can start to unwind. So that's your first principle, bone stimulation. Does anybody, hey Vicky, nice to see you, girl. Vicky is a fellow Yamuna practitioner. She and I work together at the flagship Yamuna studio in the West Village for many years. Now she's in the Pacific. Actually, I think you're in California. Vicki, great to see you. Hey, Bridget, nice to see you too. Glad to have you here. We talked a little bit about this in class today, yesterday, Bridget, but you'll get a little more detail on it today. Okay, so that's your first piece. Bone stimulation. Let me make sure I didn't forget any concepts there. Okay, that's about all of it. Okay, so the next one, again, these are no particular order, but the next one is important too. Where there is pain or restriction, there is almost always a lack of space. So I'm going to say it again to kind of let that settle. Where there's pain or restriction, there is also lack of space. So when we say lack of space, we kind of touched on it a little bit already, the idea of the tissue being snarled up and tangled up. It does that when it doesn't have enough space to actually spread out. So one of the core principles of YBR is to restore space in the joints, restore space between the bones so that the fibers of the tissue have a place to actually unwind. So let's try a little experiential thing with that. So back to the hamstring example, and I'll go over there in a second and get back into the position with my leg out in front of me. Let me get Skelly's arm out of the way here so you can kind of see what's happening. Oops. Oh, well, there you go. Hopefully you won't get that much space in your body. That's pretty drastic right there. This particular the other side. I'll repair it later. Yeah, don't give yourself that much space. That's pretty funny. Okay, anyway, so pretend your leg is stretched out in front of you and you have the ball right here. Move your hand, Skelly. Right here on your sit bone. Do you see this little space right here? This is your femur head. This is the top of your thigh bone. This is your sit bone. This tiny little space right here is where your hamstring tendons live. This is where they live. This is where they tend to get stuck together. And this is where they get all bunched up. So the hamstrings, of course, the tendons feed into the muscle, the belly of the muscle, and they actually extend all the way down the leg and attach near the knee. So by restoring space in the back of the hip joint, and that's what this is here. This is the back side of your hip joint. By restoring space there, we allow the tendons to start to unwind and sort of work towards their insertion point, and then from there we can actually begin to iron out the soft tissue. So let's try it together on the ball. So we already did the weight bearing into the sit bone. That gave the signal to the hamstring tendons that something was about to happen. Then you did your rolling, which started to get into that space a little bit. Now I want to show you how sort of minute this distance is. So right now I'm on my sit bone. If I want to go into that space that we just looked at on Skelly there, if you think of like your thigh bone going this way and your sit bone's pointing straight down, there's a space there that is the back of your hip joint, right? So in order to get into that space and widen it out a little bit, once again, we start by bearing weight into the bone. We take a breath in. As we exhale, we sink straight down into the ball. So I have a sense of the ball being squeezed between my body weight and the floor beneath me. Then at the bottom of my exhale, when I'm sort of at my most weighted, I'm going to just inch my hips backwards a bit. Notice the tiny distance I went. I went from here to here. So we were very, very small in the Yamuna work. So now I'm in this space between my thigh bone and my sit bone. Immediately I feel the intensity increase because again, I'm now in soft tissue. So as I roll into the hamstring tendons, that translates down my leg because the hamstrings go all the way down to my knee. So I can actually feel this stretch behind my knee, a little bit even beyond as that starts to affect the muscles beyond that. So while you're here, you might have noticed as soon as you rolled into that space that your leg sort of tried to resist it or kind of press against it or push against the ball. That's a normal response, but I want you to try to do the opposite of that. So do what I call the jiggle test. So you really want your leg to be as jiggly as possible. If you're doing this and it's a brick and it's not moving, you are gripping in your quadriceps and in the other muscles of your leg. And we want to not grip. We want to do the opposite of that. We want to invite the ball up into the space. We don't want to push it away. So in order to get that sense of welcoming the ball, encouraging the ball into the space, you can give yourself a little hands-on assist here. And again, Bridget, we did this yesterday in class, so this should seem a little familiar to you. You can take your hand right on top of where the ball is and just press down. So in in-person setting, when I'm working with people one-on-one, I actually come around and give you hands-on assist here, which gives you the sense of really letting the ball penetrate through into that space. So you want to have a feeling of the leg sort of wrapping around the ball, blanketing the ball, enveloping the ball, whatever image works for you. But the idea is that the ball's coming up into the space, encouraging the thigh bone to move out of the joint. We don't want our thigh bone to be stuck up in the joint, right? This is a little sidebar, but it's worth mentioning here. I often hear people tell me that they have one leg longer than the other. And you might be one of those people. Oh, there's Rochelle. Hi, Rochelle. Yeah, Skelly suffered some injury here. We'll get him back in shape in a minute. But anyway, I often hear people say that they have one leg longer than the other. While that may be true, and I think that something like 1 or 2% of people do have actually longer bone on one side, usually when someone has one leg, like a leg length discrepancy, it's not that one's longer, it's that one side is stuck inside the hip joint more. So what I mean by that is that femur head that we just looked at there on Skelly, it gets locked up into the hip joint, again, from all of these tight adhesions of the tendons and fascia and everything that sort of surrounds it. So when those fibers get really sticky and gripped together, they hold the bone in that place, and the bone it's stuck then. It doesn't have any way to lengthen out. Even if it wants to, it can't, because there's all of this adhesion around it. So typically when someone has one leg longer than the other, it's just that they've never had any like manual wriggling free of the bone, and they've never been able to get the space in there. So we, of course, we work to do that, and a lot of times we can totally alleviate like orthotics and stuff that have lifts in your shoes and things like that. Those are not necessarily the best solution for a problem like that. They're great little band-aids, but if you really want to cause, get to the root cause of the problem, you want to get the space in there. So I think that makes sense. Let me know if that's not making sense if you're trying this with me. Hey, Sue. Skelly will be easier to pack in pieces. Yeah, I'm not sure if Skelly's coming with me or not. I haven't thought about that, but good point. I can put him in like the old puppets that ventriloquists used to use. I'll put him like in a little case and put them all together. That would be really funny. Okay, so those are the first two principles. The first one was bone stimulation. The second one is lack of space creates pain or restriction. So just to really drive that concept home, why that leads to pain or restriction, if there's no space in the joint, then using that sort of hiked up hip example, if the leg is stuck up in the hip, you can imagine that that leads to all kinds of issues, right? Because if your hips are not even, or if your legs aren't even, then you have to make all kinds of compensations. You might find that the other side is doing more work than it needs to do. That could lead to strain or injury. So the lack of space is not always where the pain presents. It often is, but sometimes it's somewhere else that there's like a domino effect, a ripple effect, that this affects that, affects that, affects that, and then the pain presents somewhere like your left ankle, but really the lack of space is like up in your right hip. So this work is very much about like kind of gathering data and following it along and troubleshooting and sleuthing and figuring out like how this is working. So just to throw that out there, that sometimes you have to really go down the rabbit hole with your detective work. Okay, so principle number 3, this is in direct relation. So if there's a lack of space, how do we restore space? Through tractioning. So I already demonstrated the ball up into the hip joint. It was really as we were pressing down, giving those little assists, that is creating traction. So traction is when you sort of stabilize on one end and pull out on the other end so that you are really restoring space. So kind of go back to that example of the ball in the back of the hip joint here. The last time I was here showing you this, I just had you sit. But now I'll have you try what we call a little cross-fibering. And cross-fibering is when we intersect the muscle fibers. So in this case, the muscle fibers run vertically from the hip to the knee. So to intersect them, we would move horizontally. And this is part of the traction. So you can put your hand on your leg and give it a gentle but firm encouragement out of the hip joint, and that's your traction piece. So you're physically manually tractioning your leg out, and then if you cross fiber within that space that you have widened out, you've made more space there. As you cross fiber, you are intersecting those hamstring tendons of which there are 3. So as you are going back and forth on those tendons, you're gently freeing them. The example I like to use is guitar strings. So if you have guitar strings on a guitar and they're all glued together, obviously you can't play the music like you want to, but if you were able to work those strings free, well, now you can pluck them. All the notes are you know, beautiful and melodious. So that's the point of this work, is you basically want to free up those those 3 hamstring tendons through this sort of creating space and through this tractioning concept. So that was the principle number 3. Traction, create space. Of course, stop me as we go. If there's any questions at all as we go, type them in the comments. Okay, so we have just a couple of more. And this brings me to my next one, because I talked already about the muscle fibers moving vertically from hip to knee. And we touched on this a bit last week in our frequently asked question lecture class as well. But the 4th principle is the body has a natural logic and order. The body has a natural logic and order, and we always follow it. We never randomly roll. We never just kind of like roll around up and down, who knows which way. We always go origin to insertion, except for those cross-fibering when we are intersecting. That's a different concept, but we're not going the opposite way when we do that. We're still following the body's order when we do that cross-fibering. But when we're working from origin to insertion, we are encouraging the muscle to unwind in the direction that it actually inserts. And we know that the muscle fibers move in a certain direction because people do cadaver dissections. You can see on the muscle fibers, you can see that they go a certain way. I think the example that I used last week was like a cat. If you're petting a cat, you pet them in the way that their fur goes, right? If you go the opposite way, some cats like it, but most cats don't. If you go the opposite way, they usually make a funny little like kind of noise because it feels kind of weird. And it's the same way if you roll the wrong way or the opposite way up your muscle fibers. So this can be a little daunting for people at first when they first start, because if you don't have an anatomy background, you might feel really overwhelmed, like how do I know if I'm going the right way? You don't actually have to know really anything about anatomy in order to follow this concept. A great guideline is the origin of the muscle is usually more near the center of your body. So in the case of the hamstrings, the origin is up here, not down here. So I'm not ever going to start here and roll this way. That would be incredibly confusing for my nervous system. It would be sending the wrong message. It would be saying, okay, now we're going to put that leg back up in the hip. We're going to reduce the space. It's the opposite of what we want to do, right? So if you just start to kind of think, well, I want space here, so then I'm certainly going to roll that way. I'm going to start more towards my center and roll out to the insertion point. And the same can be said for other muscle groups as well. For instance, if you're going to do like some sort of shoulder or arm release, you would start more towards the center and the sternum, roll out towards the more distant area. So you can always use that guideline of origin is closer to the center, insertion is more distal. So you can do that without knowing anything about your anatomy. You don't have to know the names of your muscles. You don't have to know where they are, what they do, because you can feel them whether or not you know the names of them, right? So when you start doing this practice, you'll start to just have an innate understanding of if you're going the wrong way, your body's probably going to tell you. Your body's going to probably not feel great if you go insertion to origin, the opposite way. Let me see if there's any other notes I had on that topic. I don't think so. I think that's it. So hopefully that makes sense for that particular principle. Always follow the body's natural logic and order. Again, this is one of the things that sets it apart from other, like for instance, like foam rolling or something where there's not usually a lot of education that goes with it that tells you to go from origin to insertion. In fact, I see people all the time rolling up their leg from their knee up to their hip, and I cringe every time because I want them to feel better, and I know that they're not if they're not following the body's natural logic and order. So those are your first 4. Your final one is pretty simple. This all leads to structural reorganization. So by first stimulating bone, then restoring space, then tractioning out from origin to insertion, all of this process leads to this wonderful result of full structural reorganization. And what we really mean by that is kind of like returning to your original like cellular and muscle memory. So, you know, when we're born, we're in optimal alignment, usually, unless there was like trauma during our birth. Sometimes we can get really beat up during our birth. So in that case, this might not apply, but typically our body, we're born understanding where our structure needs to be, how to maintain that structure without, you know, all of the tension patterns and the stress and the injuries and the impact, all of that comes later in life, which then of course leads to less than optimal movement patterns and stuff. But we're born without that noise yet. We're born understanding where to be in space. And so the whole concept of this work is to help you return to that. And that is what ultimately leads to body sustainability. So as many of you know, this is part of an umbrella of work called Yamuna Body Sustainability. And the concept of that is that you can live your whole life moving and doing what you love to do as long as you're practicing these sustainability maintenance techniques. So if you follow the 4 principles that I mentioned before, that ultimately will lead you to a life of full structural reorganization where you can move freely, you have excellent range of motion, you're less prone to injury, less tension, you know, all your systems work better. I mean, the list of benefits goes on and on. I'll stop there, but they really are dozens and dozens of benefits when your body is in its proper structure, because most of us know structure rules function. Function can definitely affect structure, but ultimately structure comes first, and that affects the function. And then the function continues to work well and effortlessly, and your structure maintains itself. So that's kind of how it sort of completes the loop. So just one last final thing to sort of demonstrate. And again, if you have your ball with you, I invite you to join me. If you want to have a sense of that sort of releasing toward the insertion point. We've already stimulated the bone. We've already created some space here. How do you actually encourage that muscle to lengthen out? How do you iron out the muscle? Well, get those out of the way there. Just like we did when we went from the sit bone to the joint, now we just keep going. So once again, you take your little jiggle test. Make sure you're nice and relaxed. Take a couple of breaths in. Find that sack of potatoes feeling, or the other image I like to use is imagine that you're floating on your back in a pool. Not on a raft or anything, just floating there. You have to fully relax. You have to be like a sack of potatoes. You have to have buoyancy in your body. If you grip at all at any point while you're floating there, if you tighten up or you get scared or you contract a muscle, what happens? You sink down into the water, right? You don't float. So imagine that you are floating. You're finding your full weight so that you can be buoyant enough to float. Sinking straight down, and then you just slide back again. So you keep going in this way. Now this particular routine is actually a little trickier than some, because you have to figure out what to do, how to balance and what to do with this other leg. So I'm going to give you a couple of options. My favorite hack is to fold this leg under. So if this is available to you, you can fold your leg under. If you've ever had knee injuries or surgeries in your knee and you don't have that full flexion anymore, then there's a couple of other things that you can do using either another ball or a yoga block or a stack of books or a pillow. You would just stack something underneath that other side so that you can balance. And then from there, I'm going to go quickly for time's sake today, but from there you would just continue down the leg, stopping at every little point to breathe and sink into the ball, wrapping around the ball, using those hands as an assist, enveloping the ball, using the ball to penetrate through tissue, etc. So these concepts are applied to every single routine that we do. And there's hundreds of them. So I gave you just one example today, but every routine that we do follows those 5 basic principles, always follows the body's anatomical logic. And again, leads to this whole structural reorganization that in turn supports your body's sustainability. So those are the 5 principles: bone stimulation, creating and restoring space, tractioning, following the body's natural logic and order, and structural reorganization. So does anybody have any questions about that? Feel free to type them in the comments, either now or if you're watching on replay, again, you can type them then and I will see them. They seem really kind of intuitive to me because I've been doing this for so long, but I realize that these are not necessarily super obvious to people. So if you have any questions at all, please do feel free to ask. And if not, right here in this thread, always feel free to post in the group. I'm really hoping to sort of get people to speak out more in the group so that it's not just my voice, because I really want to amplify everyone's voices. So if you have questions now or in the future, please do feel free to post in the group. Otherwise, I will be back next week, same time, same place, and well, not the same exact place, but same place here in the internet. So I look forward to seeing you then, and in the meantime, have a great week, and let me know what questions you have. Okay, thanks everyone. Bye-bye.